I watched my father cry on national television this morning. He dabbed his eyes with a silk handkerchief, telling the world how I ruthlessly banned him from seeing his 5-year-old granddaughter. He played the heartbroken patriarch perfectly. The internet is already tearing me apart, calling me an ungrateful daughter who stole his corporate legacy. But the cameras didn't show the night he threw me into the freezing New York snow, pregnant and penniless. He doesn't want my child. He wants the $15 million empire I built from the ashes he left me in. Does a man who threw his pregnant daughter into the street deserve the title of grandfather? Let me know where and what time you are listening to this story. He made a fatal mistake. The garment district in New York has a specific heartbeat. It thrums with the sound of freight elevators, the hiss of industrial steam irons, and the heavy rhythmic punch of sewing machines. This was my sanctuary. I stood in the centre of my studio, running my fingers over a bolt of raw organic silk. Edith, my 5-year-old daughter, sat quietly in the corner on a velvet rug, carefully arranging her coloured pencils by shade. She was safe, she was happy, and she was entirely mine. Over the past 5 years, I had built a sustainable luxury brand called Silverbird. It was worth millions. Though nobody in the industry knew the face behind the label, I kept my identity completely hidden. Anonymity was my armour against the past. Then the heavy black phone on my cutting table rang. It was Patricia. Patricia was not just an attorney. She was a legal sniper specialising in intellectual property and corporate finance. Her voice on the line was perfectly level, which always meant the situation was severe. She told me the veil was gone. Someone had connected the dots between my LLC and the Silverbird trademark. That someone was Douglas. He had not only figured out I was the ghost designer behind the industry's rising star, but he had already made his move. Patricia listed the damages in a cool, methodical tone. Douglas had filed an emergency petition in family court, demanding partial custody and visitation rights to Edith, but that was merely the emotional smokescreen. The real attack was commercial. His corporate lawyers had just fired off cease and desist letters to my 3 biggest international retailers, claiming that Silverbird was operating under stolen family intellectual property. He was threatening them with secondary liability if they did not freeze my upcoming seasonal orders. I looked at the silk under my hands. I did not panic. I did not cry. I simply asked Patricia to schedule an emergency meeting at her office for 3 o'clock. Douglas was drowning in corporate debt, and his own retail empire was crumbling. He was not looking for family reconciliation. He was looking for a very specific lifeline, and he intended to use my child and my company to pull himself out of the grave. He smelled the money. To understand the absolute audacity of his current legal manoeuvre, you have to understand the bitter truth of 5 winters ago, the night Douglas threw me out. The temperature in Manhattan had dropped below freezing. I was 19. I was pregnant. I had entirely disappointed his grand vision for the family's pristine social image. He did not yell. He simply handed me 2 trash bags, pointed to the heavy oak doors of the estate, and told me I no longer existed in his ledger. For a long time, I lived in a state of absolute paralysing compliance. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. When the person who is supposed to protect you conditions you to believe that your worth is tied solely to your obedience. You stop fighting back. You accept the cold. You accept the hunger. You accept the narrative that you brought the misery upon yourself. I moved into a mold-infested studio apartment in Queens. The radiator barely hissed. I taped cardboard over the cracked window panes to keep the winter wind from reaching the corner where I slept. I survived on discount rice and the sheer, terrifying willpower of a mother trying to keep a heartbeat going inside her. My only fragile connection to my past life was Connor. My younger brother was still trapped inside Douglas's house. Financially dependent and terrified of the man, but Connor found a way. One evening, he sneaked out and brought me a heavy, rust-stained industrial sewing machine that Douglas had ordered thrown out from one of his old factories. That rusty machine became my lifeline. I sat under a flickering bare bulb, day after day, night after night, taking in cheap alteration jobs from local dry cleaners. I sewed until the skin on my fingertips cracked and bled onto the fabric. Every cent went into a glass jar for prenatal vitamins and formula. I did not ask Douglas for a single dime. I endured the silence because I believed I was entirely alone, completely abandoned by the one person I thought had loved me. Tuesday morning changed everything. The heavy studio door clicked open, breaking my focus. Patricia had promised to send someone over to review the initial court filings, but the man standing in the doorway of my atelier was not a paralegal. It was Zeus. He wore a dark tailored overcoat, his presence instantly shifting the air in the room. He was the silent investor of a global luxury conglomerate, a man whose wealth was old and deeply quiet. More importantly, he was Edith's father. We had spent one brief, intense season together before the reality of his corporate obligations and my family's toxic interference had pulled us apart. I thought he had simply walked away when things got complicated. Zeus did not step forward to offer a dramatic, sweeping embrace. Instead, he walked slowly to the cutting table and placed a thick, heavy stack of envelopes down on the canvas. They were old, the edges were worn, and the postage stamps dated back 5 solid years. Every single envelope bore the logo of an elite trust management firm. He looked at me, his eyes dark with a mixture of quiet fury and profound regret. He told me he had never walked away. The moment he found out about the pregnancy, 5 years ago, he had immediately initiated a support protocol through his legal team, sending monthly cashier's checks and handwritten letters to the estate. I reached out and picked up the top envelope. Across the front, stamped in bold, aggressive red ink, were the words, "Return to sender. Refuses contact." Right beneath that stamp was a signature. My signature. Or rather, a flawless, perfectly executed forgery of my handwriting. The blood rushed entirely out of my head, leaving a cold, sharp clarity in its wake. Douglas had intercepted every single piece of correspondence. He had forged my refusal. He had meticulously engineered a scenario where Zeus believed I wanted nothing to do with him, and I believed Zeus had abandoned his child. Douglas had not merely kicked me out, he had actively built a wall around me to ensure I would starve in isolation. He wanted me broken. He wanted me crawling back to him on my knees. It sparked a war. Zeus paced the length of the studio, the heavy wooden floorboards creaking under his boots. The revelation of the forged letters had shattered his usual stoic composure. He ran a hand through his hair, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. He wanted to destroy Douglas immediately. He proposed an instant, impenetrable shield. We would get married the following morning at the courthouse. He argued that a legal union with his family name would instantly neutralize Douglas's custody petition and terrify the retailers back into compliance. Furthermore, he wanted to immediately transfer $10 million into a liquid account for Edith, putting an end to any financial leverage Douglas thought he held. I listened to him carefully. I understood his anger. I understood his fierce, sudden need to protect the daughter he had been robbed of knowing. But I remained perfectly still. I walked over to the drafting board, picked up a charcoal pencil, and set it down again. I looked directly at Zeus and told him no, I would not marry him to solve a legal dispute. I refused to turn the concept of marriage into a tactical maneuver or a bulletproof vest. I had spent 5 grueling years building my own armour, stitch by bleeding stitch, and I was not going to trade one controlling patriarch for a benevolent saviour. I required a partner, not a shield. However, I did not let pride ruin practical strategy. I agreed to the educational trust fund for Edith, but I set absolute non-negotiable boundaries. The trust would be established independently. I would be designated as the mandatory co-trustee alongside his financial officers. The capital would be locked into a staggered release schedule that Edith could only access upon reaching specific adult milestones. No one, not Zeus, not me, and certainly never Douglas, could liquidate it to settle a lawsuit or leverage a business deal. Zeus stopped pacing. He looked at me, truly looking at the woman I had become, rather than the frightened 19-year-old he remembered. He nodded once, accepting the terms without a single argument. He respected the boundary. But the legal document sitting on my desk reminded us both of the immediate danger. The real threat remained. The air in my studio was usually a sanctuary of predictability. I controlled the fabrics, I controlled the lighting, and I controlled the silence. But that Thursday afternoon, my production manager, Yvonne, walked into my office, holding a tablet with a trembling hand. She placed it on my drafting table without saying a word. On the screen was a leaked post from a notoriously aggressive fashion gossip blog. It featured a blurry, unauthorized photograph of a silk trench coat, a design that was supposed to be the closely guarded centerpiece of Silverbird's upcoming autumn collection. The caption claimed an anonymous tipster had leaked the next big thing. What chilled my blood was not the leak itself, but the watermark on the table in the photograph. It was from Douglas's primary manufacturing warehouse. I did not scream. I did not throw the tablet against the brick wall. I sat down at my desk and zoomed in on the image. I have a very specific habit when sewing prototype garments. I always implement a slightly flawed, asymmetrical basting stitch on the inner left shoulder seam. It is my invisible signature, a method to track early drafts. I stared at the screen. The asymmetrical stitch was clearly visible. That specific prototype had never left my secure atelier. It had been sitting in a locked cabinet just 2 days ago. Someone in my very small, highly trusted inner circle had photographed it and sent it directly to Douglas. My mind began to race, compartmentalizing the betrayal into logical steps. Douglas was not a designer. He did not want to steal the coat to manufacture it. He wanted to prove that he had eyes inside my operation. He was trying to induce paranoia, hoping I would tear my own company apart, hunting for a mole. I realised he was likely blackmailing a mid-level employee, perhaps holding a work visa or a medical debt over their head. I refused to give him the satisfaction of a witch hunt. Instead of firing anyone, I opened my secure server and meticulously created 3 slightly different, entirely fake technical design packets for the upcoming season. I distributed each fake packet to a specific, separate sector of my team. I would let the mole steal again. I would track exactly which fake design ended up on Douglas's desk. I laid the trap. The next morning, I sat across from Patricia in her glass-walled office overlooking Manhattan. I handed her the printout of the leaked design. She barely glanced at the fabric. Her eyes were immediately calculating the legal geometry of the situation. Patricia steepled her fingers and explained the harsh reality of family court litigation. She told me to stop looking at the custody petition as an emotional attack. It was not about a grandfather missing his grandchild. It was a Trojan horse. In legal terms, it was a brutal fishing expedition. Patricia laid out the architecture of his scheme. By filing for partial custody and accusing me of being an overworked, unstable mother, Douglas was forcing the court to evaluate my living situation. That evaluation required full financial transparency. To prove I was a fit parent, the court would compel me to open my books, reveal the corporate structure of Silverbird, and disclose the exact terms of my investment agreements with Zeus. Douglas did not want to read bedtime stories to Edith. He wanted full legal access to the financial blueprints of a company currently valued at $15 million. He was suffering from a profound narcissistic injury. Douglas had spent his entire life believing that he was the absolute architect of his family's reality. He threw me out expecting me to fail, expecting me to crawl back and beg for his mercy so he could play the benevolent saviour. Instead, I had survived. I had thrived in complete secrecy, building an empire that far surpassed his crumbling retail business. His bank had recently issued a final warning on an $8.5 million debt. He wasn't acting out of love. He was acting out of pure, desperate entitlement. He genuinely believed that my success was stolen property. Simply because I shared his DNA, he needed to conquer me to fix his own shattered ego. He needed to rip my empire apart to patch the holes in his own. Edith was just a key. The rain in New York that evening was freezing and relentless. I was working late at the studio when the security buzzer rang. It was Connor. My younger brother stood in the doorway, completely soaked, his shoulders hunched with a visible crushing weight. I handed him a dry towel and poured him a cup of hot coffee. He didn't drink it. He just stared at the dark liquid, his hands shaking slightly. Over the past 5 years, Connor had been my only tether to humanity, the boy who smuggled out a sewing machine to keep me alive. Now, he looked entirely broken. He spoke in a low, hollow voice, confessing the sins he had been forced to carry. The family retail business had been hemorrhaging money for years. Douglas, desperate to hide the bleeding from investors, had handed Connor stacks of administrative paperwork claiming they were just standard internal restructuring forms. Connor, conditioned by a lifetime of fear and obedience, had signed them without looking too closely. He had unknowingly become the nominal director of several shell companies. Those very same shell companies were now being used to purchase my client data, fund the negative PR campaigns against me, and hide assets from Douglas's creditors. If the authorities looked into the financial fraud, the paper trail pointed directly to my brother. But that was not the confession that made the air leave my lungs. Connor looked up at me, tears mixing with the rain on his face. He told me that 3 months ago. Douglas had asked him to dig up an old family tax document to close out a dormant account. To do it, Connor had accessed an old hard drive and inadvertently handed Douglas a high-resolution, unencrypted file of my authentic digital signature from 5 years ago. He hadn't realised what he had done until the custody lawsuit hit the news. Douglas had weaponised his own son, turning his compliance into a tool to destroy me. I did not scream at Connor. I simply placed my hand over his shaking fingers. Douglas wanted us to tear each other apart. I would not let him win. The knife was already twisting. The revelation of the stolen digital signature sent Patricia into an aggressive forensic audit of my entire financial history. For 3 days, her team of forensic accountants combed through every single bank statement, tax return, and wire transfer I had received since the night I was thrown into the street. We sat in her conference room, surrounded by boxes of printed financial records. Patricia suddenly stopped, her finger pressing hard against a single line item from exactly 5 years ago. It was a deposit of $500. It had appeared in my checking account during my darkest, most desperate month, right after Edith was born. The sender was listed under a vague, generic corporate acronym. At the time, I was exhausted and starving. I had assumed it was an automated tax rebate or a delayed municipal grant. That money had bought formula, diapers, and electricity for a month. I never questioned it because survival does not afford you the luxury of an audit. Patricia pulled up the tracing report. The money had bounced through 3 different regional banks, filtered through a holding company, and originated from a private account controlled directly by Douglas. The sheer, breathtaking malice of the strategy became instantly clear. Douglas had not sent that money to help his starving daughter. He had sent it to plant a highly calculated legal seed by funneling a traceable sum into my business account during the foundational months of Silverbird. He was preparing a narrative. He was going to stand in front of a commercial judge and claim that he was not an estranged, abusive father, but an early-stage angel investor who had provided the crucial seed capital for my startup. He was going to use a $500 lifeline to justify demanding over half of a $15 million company. It was not a gesture of hidden guilt. It was the careful, methodical planting of a parasite. He was building a snare. The psychological warfare shifted seamlessly from the courtroom to the television screen. On Monday morning, I stood in my office, watching a prominent daytime talk show. Douglas was sitting on a plush white sofa. Beside him sat a highly polished woman introduced as a renowned family dynamics expert. The segment was flawlessly produced. They did not outright call me an abusive mother. They used language that was far more insidious, wrapped in the velvet gloves of clinical concern. The expert looked directly into the camera with a sympathetic smile. She spoke about the psychological damage inflicted on children who are intentionally isolated from their extended family. She mused, in a soft, warning tone, that an overworked, highly successful CEO mother might unconsciously become emotionally absent, substituting financial wealth for genuine familial presence. Douglas simply nodded, letting a single practiced tear escape, murmuring that he only wanted to ensure little Edith knew her grandfather's love. It was a masterclass in character assassination. He was painting a portrait of me as a cold, calculating corporate machine who used her child as a prop. The corporate fallout was terrifyingly swift. Before the broadcast had even ended, my phone began to vibrate constantly. A major luxury department store in London called my sales director to abruptly pause our upcoming seasonal distribution contract, citing concerns over negative brand association. My smaller fabric suppliers demanded cash up front, spooked by the sudden legal drama surrounding their most lucrative client. Douglas was systematically draining the oxygen from my business environment. He knew that the family court system moved slowly, but commercial panic moved at the speed of light. He was squeezing the financial throat of my company, attempting to force me to the negotiating table before a judge ever had to render a verdict. The real bleed had begun. The pressure inside my New York studio was no longer just a psychological weight. It had materialized into a tangible financial strangulation. Douglas had executed his commercial sabotage with the precision of a seasoned corporate predator. By mid-morning on Wednesday, my chief financial officer walked into my office, her face a mask of carefully suppressed panic. Our largest European retail partner, a luxury department store chain based in London, had officially issued a suspension notice on our upcoming autumn collection. They cited a standard reputational risk and pending litigation clause in our distribution contract. It was a multi-million-dollar order, the financial backbone of our entire seasonal production run. Following their lead, two major fabric suppliers in Italy suddenly demanded full cash payments up front, abruptly revoking our standard net 60 credit terms. Douglas was systematically cutting off my oxygen supply, isolating my business just as he had once isolated me in the freezing snow. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me suffocating. Right on cue, exactly at noon, Patricia's office forwarded a formal settlement offer from Douglas's legal team. It was presented as a generous peace treaty. He offered to immediately withdraw his family court petition for visitation rights and publicly clear my name regarding the intellectual property dispute. In exchange, he asked for a seemingly benign concession, a 10-year exclusive licensing agreement, granting his manufacturing conglomerate the sole right to produce and distribute the Silverbird brand. My minor shareholders and junior executives were terrified by the sudden cash flow crisis. They urged me to sign it, arguing that a licensing deal was a small price to pay to save the company and protect Edith from a brutal custody battle. It looked like a lifeline. It sounded like a compromise. I sat alone at my drafting table, reading the 50-page document line by line. I did not rely on fear. I relied on forensic analysis. Buried deep on page 42, obscured by dense corporate jargon, was a subordination clause. The clause explicitly granted Douglas the right to use the Silverbird intellectual property as collateral for his own corporate debt. If I signed that paper, I was not partnering with my father. I was handing him the legal authority to mortgage my life's work to save his sinking, bankrupt empire. When he inevitably defaulted on his loans, the banks would seize my brand, effectively liquidating my identity to pay for his failures. I picked up my phone and called Patricia. I instructed her to reject the offer entirely and permanently block any further settlement communications. I would not sell my soul to buy a temporary peace. I chose the war. Douglas did not take my rejection quietly. When he realised he could not force me into a catastrophic licensing agreement, he immediately changed the trajectory of his attack. He aimed directly at the only person standing beside me, Zeus. On Friday morning, a leading financial news network broke an exclusive investigative report. The headline accused Zeus of severe corporate misconduct, alleging that he had bypassed his conglomerate's strict investment protocols to secretly funnel millions of dollars into the private business of a former romantic partner. Douglas had deliberately leaked the existence of Zeus's educational trust fund for Edith, twisting it into a narrative of insider trading and corporate embezzlement. He painted Zeus as a compromised executive who was using corporate resources to resolve his messy, hidden personal life. Zeus arrived at my apartment later that evening. He did not look angry, nor did he look defeated. He just looked profoundly tired. He took off his overcoat and sat at my kitchen counter, watching me pour a cup of tea. He explained the fallout in a quiet, measured voice. The board of directors at his conglomerate was furious about the sudden, aggressive media scrutiny. Institutional investors despise personal scandals, especially those involving undisclosed heirs and messy family litigation. To protect the stock price and shield the conglomerate from Douglas's relentless smear campaign, the board had issued an ultimatum. Zeus was forced to temporarily step down from his position as an executive director pending an internal ethical review. Douglas had successfully crippled him professionally. I stood by the counter, gripping the edge of the marble surface. I told Zeus I was sorry, that my toxic family was now dragging his legacy through the mud. I offered to release a public statement, clarifying that the trust was entirely independent of his corporate dealings. Zeus looked up at me and shook his head. He told me he didn't care about the executive chair, the board, or the media noise. He had spent 5 years believing I had rejected him, missing the first 5 years of his daughter's life because he had respected a forged boundary. He said stepping down was a temporary, meaningless price to pay to finally stand in the right room, on the right side of the table. For the first time, I realised Zeus was not trying to be a corporate saviour wielding a checkbook. He was simply a father willing to endure the fire. He stayed the course. The media assault did not stop with Zeus. The following Tuesday, the narrative twisted again, driving a dagger directly into the creative heart of my brand. A prominent fashion magazine published a scathing editorial claiming that Silverbird was built on stolen heritage. Douglas had provided the journalists with a series of vintage fabric swatches and early company records. He claimed that my signature motif, a delicate intertwining silver vine that had become the hallmark of my luxury line, was actually a proprietary design belonging to his historical archives. The article framed me as a talentless, ungrateful daughter who had looted her father's vaults before running away. The public backlash was immediate and vicious. The internet loves a story of a brilliant patriarch betrayed by a thieving child. I did not release a frantic, defensive press statement. I did not log on to social media to argue with strangers. Instead, I drove to my studio, locked the heavy metal door, and walked over to the corner where I kept the rusty industrial sewing machine Connor had smuggled out for me 5 years ago. I knelt on the hardwood floor and used a flathead screwdriver to carefully remove the heavy iron base plate. Beneath a layer of accumulated dust and old machine oil, there was a shallow compartment. Inside lay a stack of yellowed, fragile tracing paper, sealed in a plastic sleeve. I pulled it out and spread the sheets across my cutting table. These were not my sketches. They belonged to my mother. She had been a brilliant, intuitive designer whose talent had been systematically erased and absorbed by Douglas's ego. He had never credited her for the foundational designs of his early success. Before she passed away, she had hidden her original concept drawings, complete with dated postal stamps and her distinct, elegant signature. Among them was the original hand-drawn concept for the intertwining silver vine. She had designed it for me when I was a child. Douglas had never created the motif. He had stolen it from his wife, buried her contribution, and was now attempting to steal it back from his daughter. I carefully photographed every single page, ensuring the metadata and dates were perfectly clear. I wasn't just defending my intellectual property anymore. I was avenging her ghost. The family court hearing was scheduled for a bleak Thursday morning. The courtroom was sterile, smelling of floor wax and institutional indifference. Douglas arrived wearing his finest tailored suit, flanked by a high-priced litigator who specialised in projecting aggressive empathy. Douglas immediately began his performance. He sat at the petitioner's table, occasionally wiping his dry eyes, looking every bit the tragic, alienated grandfather, desperately seeking a connection with his estranged bloodline. His lawyer delivered a passionate opening statement about the sacred, unbreakable bond between generations and the psychological harm of parental alienation. It was a beautiful, entirely fabricated narrative designed to manipulate the judge's emotions. Patricia did not counter with emotion. She countered with a surgical application of the law. When it was her turn to speak, she remained seated for a long moment, organising her files with deliberate slowness. She did not raise her voice. She simply dismantled his entire premise. She cited the state's extremely narrow grandparent visitation statutes, which require proof of a pre-existing, substantial relationship or evidence that denying access would actively harm the child. She entered into evidence the county hospital records from Edith's birth, noting the absence of any emergency contact. She presented Douglas's own social media history, 5 years of photographs where he never once acknowledged my existence, let alone Edith's. Then, Patricia brought out the psychological assessment. Douglas had attempted to subpoena Edith to testify, hoping to force a 5-year-old onto the stand to serve as an emotional prop. Patricia had fiercely protected my daughter, securing a child psychologist's evaluation that explicitly stated involving Edith in a hostile litigation environment would be deeply traumatizing. The judge, an older woman with zero tolerance for theatrical nonsense, reviewed the documentation. She saw exactly what Douglas was: a stranger demanding access to a child he had ignored for 5 years. She did not even need to hear my testimony. She struck the gavel, declaring that the petitioner lacked standing and had failed to meet the statutory burden of proof. The petition for visitation was dismissed in its entirety. It was a clean, absolute victory. The first battle ended. The heavy wooden doors of the family court closed behind us. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the hallway felt lighter. I took a deep breath of the recycled air, feeling the immense weight of the custody threat lift from my shoulders. Edith was safe. The psychological barrier Douglas had tried to breach was now reinforced with a judicial order. Patricia offered a rare, slight smile, snapping her briefcase shut. Zeus stood by the elevators, nodding quietly. We had protected the child. We had won the emotional war. But men like Douglas do not accept defeat. They simply change the battlefield. Before we could reach the elevator bank, a man in a nondescript grey suit stepped out from the alcove near the stairwell. He did not look aggressive, merely entirely professional. He walked directly toward me, extending a thick, heavy manila envelope. "Dorothy," he asked. I didn't even have to answer. He pressed the envelope against my chest, let it drop into my hands, and walked away. Patricia's smile vanished instantly. She took the envelope from my hands, sliced it open with her pen, and pulled out a towering stack of legal filings. The header on the documents did not belong to family court. It belonged to the state's commercial litigation division. Douglas had been standing at the far end of the hallway, watching the entire exchange. The sorrowful, weeping grandfather routine evaporated from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating smirk. Patricia scanned the first page rapidly, her eyes narrowing. It was an emergency commercial injunction. Douglas was suing me for corporate fraud and breach of contract. He had requested, and been temporarily granted, an immediate freeze on all of my business assets and operating accounts. Attached to the injunction was a document that made my blood run entirely cold. It was a contract, dated 5 years ago, claiming he had provided seed capital for Silverbird in exchange for 51% controlling equity. If a brand is built on skills learned in a family, do parents have the right to demand equity? Let me know in the comments if you think biology equals ownership. At the bottom of that contract was my signature. The commercial injunction was a masterpiece of weaponized paperwork. It arrived with a stack of heavily stamped court orders that effectively neutralized my entire corporate existence in a matter of hours. By Friday morning, the financial freeze had cascaded through every level of my business. Yvonne, my production manager, walked into my office holding a stack of returned payroll checks. The main operating accounts for Silverbird were locked in a judicial vault. My fabric suppliers in Italy received automated notices that our letters of credit had been suspended. In the cutthroat ecosystem of luxury fashion, a frozen supply chain is a death sentence. A brand can survive a bad collection, but it cannot survive an inability to pay its seamstresses. The silence in my studio was no longer peaceful. It was the chilling quiet of a machine that had been forcefully unplugged. Douglas wasted no time capitalizing on the legal chokehold. He understood that a commercial lawsuit was not just fought in the courtroom, it was fought in the industry press. He stood on the steps of the courthouse, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, surrounded by microphones. He looked directly into the cameras and declared himself the silent, founding architect of Silverbird. He spoke about how he had provided the crucial seed capital 5 years ago to help his struggling daughter build a dream. He held up a copy of the forged investment contract, pointing to my digital signature at the bottom. He claimed he was stepping in now only to protect his 51% equity from my supposed mismanagement. The preliminary forensic expert appointed by the court had already filed a sworn affidavit regarding that contract. The digital signature was, mathematically and technically, completely authentic. It was the exact encrypted signature file I had used on a rental lease 5 years ago, the one Connor had inadvertently leaked from the family archives. Based on that single stroke of verified digital ink, the commercial judge had granted the emergency freeze. Douglas's legal strategy was brutally simple. He did not need to win the lawsuit immediately. He only needed to drag it out long enough for my company to run out of operating cash. He was starving me out. expecting me to eventually surrender my equity in exchange for lifting the freeze. I sat at my desk, looking at the payroll checks Yvonne had brought in. I did not panic. I did not reach for the phone to beg for a settlement. I calmly opened my laptop and emailed Patricia a single sentence. The trap was set. I met Patricia in her office later that afternoon. The city below was a grid of rushing traffic, but inside her conference room, the atmosphere was absolute clinical stillness. I handed her the copy of the injunction. She did not look worried. She poured a glass of water, sat down across from me, and began to explain the architecture of modern wealth protection. It was time to activate the contingency plan we had quietly built 3 years ago. Douglas believed he had cornered me by claiming 51% of my limited liability company. He fundamentally misunderstood the anatomy of my business. Patricia outlined the concept of an irrevocable IP trust. A standard business LLC is merely an operating vehicle. It manages the day-to-day cash flow and the employee payroll. But the actual value of a luxury fashion house does not lie in its bank accounts. It lies entirely in its intellectual property, the trademarks, the signature patterns, the brand name itself. 3 years ago, when Silverbird first began generating serious revenue, I had quietly transferred total ownership of every single trademark and design patent out of my LLC and into an independent, anonymous trust. The sole irrevocable beneficiary of that trust was Edith. I did not own the brand. I was merely the creative director licensing the rights from my daughter's trust fund. The legal implications were catastrophic for Douglas. An irrevocable trust removes the asset completely from the grantor's taxable and legal estate. It is a financial fortress. Even if the judge ultimately ruled that his forged contract was valid, and even if he was somehow awarded 51% of my operating LLC, he would be claiming majority ownership of an empty vessel. He would own half of a company that had to pay licensing fees to a 5-year-old girl just to print its own name on a label. Douglas had spent tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees to hijack a train, completely unaware that I had decoupled the engine years ago. Patricia smiled, a sharp, terrifying expression that never quite reached her eyes. We were not going to tell him about the trust yet. We were going to let him walk blindly into a federal courtroom and perjure himself first. He dug his own grave. The paper armour was in place, but we still needed a weapon to permanently dismantle his narrative. We spent the entire weekend inside Patricia's secure conference room, assembling a digital guillotine. A contract with an authentic signature is difficult to defeat, but a digital file is inherently flawed because it possesses a memory. It records the exact circumstances of its own birth. Patricia had hired an independent, highly specialised digital forensics firm to pull the metadata from the PDF Douglas had submitted to the court. Metadata is the invisible DNA of a document. It does not care about emotional testimonies or tailored suits. The forensic report came back on Sunday night, and it was devastating. Douglas claimed the contract was signed 5 years ago in his home office. However, the document's embedded timestamp proved the file had been generated a mere 6 months ago. Furthermore, the font utilised in the body of the contract was a specific, proprietary typeface released by a tech company only 3 years prior. It was a chronological impossibility. The file also carried the digital registry tag of the specific computer used to encode it. It was registered to the chief financial officer of Douglas's retail conglomerate. We paired this technical assassination with the audio file Connor had provided. Connor had secretly recorded a meeting where Douglas instructed his CFO to manufacture the necessary leverage. The recording was grainy, but Douglas's voice was unmistakable. He didn't use the word forgery, but the implication was crystalline. He commanded his team to make the numbers fit the timeline and to use the signature file Connor dug up. He was meticulously engineering a corporate theft to cover his own bankruptcy. We placed the forensic report and the audio transcript into a heavy black binder. The evidence was irrefutable. It elevated the situation from a civil contract dispute to federal criminal fraud. If you discovered your own family was trying to frame you for corporate fraud, would you walk away or fight back? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The execution was fully prepared. The commercial court division operates on a completely different frequency than family court. There is no pretense of emotional reconciliation here. It is an arena built for the surgical dissection of capital. The courtroom was panelled in dark, heavy mahogany. Douglas sat at the plaintiff's table, looking incredibly relaxed. He chatted amiably with his silver-haired litigator, projecting the quiet confidence of a patriarch who was merely stepping in to discipline an unruly subordinate. He glanced over at my table and offered a tight, patronising smile. He genuinely believed I was sitting there with a frozen bank account and zero leverage. The judge, a stern man, with a reputation for moving through dockets with ruthless efficiency, called the hearing to order. Douglas's attorney stood up to present the motion for summary judgment. He argued that the case was exceedingly straightforward. He highlighted the preliminary expert's affidavit confirming the authenticity of my digital signature on the equity transfer contract. He painted a picture of a benevolent father who had provided the foundational risk capital for Silverbird, only to be shut out when the company finally achieved international profitability. He requested the court permanently enforce the 51% ownership transfer and grant Douglas immediate executive control over the LLC to prevent further financial mismanagement. I sat next to Patricia, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not glare at Douglas. I did not shake my head in indignation. I simply watched the performance with the detached interest of someone observing a predictable play. The opposing counsel spoke elegantly about the sanctity of written contracts and the bedrock principles of corporate equity. He demanded that the court respect the binding nature of the digital ink. He was entirely unaware that he was building a massive, highly visible pedestal from which his client was about to violently fall. The judge reviewed the plaintiff's summary, adjusting his glasses, seemingly satisfied with the paper trail presented by the opposition. Then Patricia stood up. Before deploying our primary weapon, Patricia decided to systematically dismantle Douglas's credibility. Douglas's lawyer called their first and only witness to the stand. It was a man named Arthur, the owner of the dilapidated Queen's apartment building where I had lived during my darkest 5 years. Arthur swore under oath that he had personally witnessed Douglas visiting the property multiple times. He claimed he saw Douglas carrying boxes of luxury fabrics, paying my rent in cash, and offering me business advice in the hallway. It was a carefully rehearsed script designed to corroborate the narrative that Douglas was an active, supportive angel investor from the very beginning. Patricia approached the podium holding a single, thin folder. She did not raise her voice. She cross-examined him with the terrifying politeness of a predator playing with its food. She asked Arthur to confirm the exact dates of these alleged visits. He rattled them off confidently. Then, Patricia projected a bank statement onto the courtroom monitors. It belonged to a commercial holding company registered under Arthur's name. She highlighted a massive, sudden influx of cash that had miraculously cleared his looming property tax debts just 3 weeks prior to this hearing. Patricia then projected a second document. It was the incorporation paperwork for the shell company that had wired Arthur the funds. The registered agent for that shell company was Douglas. The courtroom went entirely silent. Patricia looked at the witness and asked, in a perfectly even tone, If it was standard practice for an estranged father to pay off a landlord's six-figure tax lien in exchange for highly specific, entirely fabricated memories, Arthur's face drained of colour. He stammered, looked desperately at Douglas, and completely lost the thread of his rehearsed narrative. The judge leaned forward, his expression hardening into a scowl of profound displeasure. The perjury was exposed instantly. The first pillar shattered. The collapse of the witness sent a visible tremor through the plaintiff's table. Douglas's silver-haired litigator realised the narrative of the loving, supportive father had just been incinerated. He scrambled to contain the damage, quickly pivoting back to his only remaining fortress. He stood up, abandoning the emotional rhetoric, and desperately leaned into the technicality of the law. He loudly reminded the judge that regardless of the landlord's questionable credibility, the core of the lawsuit remained unchanged. The contract existed. He picked up the forged document and practically waved it at the bench. He argued that the corporate equity transfer did not depend on character assessments or emotional history. It depended on the verification of consent. He loudly reiterated that the court-appointed expert had definitively validated my digital signature. He claimed that Patricia was merely throwing up smoke and mirrors to distract the court from a legally binding business agreement. He demanded that the judge ignore the perjury surrounding the landlord and focus strictly on the ink. He requested immediate enforcement of the 51% transfer, claiming that any further delay would cause irreparable financial harm to his client's rightful corporate assets. I watched Douglas carefully. A bead of sweat had formed at his temple, but his jaw was set in rigid defiance. He truly believed the signature was his bulletproof vest. He thought the law was a rigid machine that would blindly process the document in his favour. He did not realise that Patricia and I had already dismantled the machine from the inside out. The judge looked at Patricia, raising an eyebrow, silently asking if the defence had any actual legal counter to the authenticated signature. The tension in the room was absolute, pulled tight as a wire. Patricia opened the black binder. Patricia did not address the opposing counsel. She spoke directly to the judge, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of an executioner. She stated that the defence did not contest the authenticity of the signature file itself. We fully admitted it was my digital signature. What we violently contested was the chronological existence of the document it was attached to. Patricia handed the forensic metadata report to the bailiff, who passed it up to the bench. She methodically walked the judge through the digital evidence. She explained the timestamp anomaly. She pointed out the proprietary font that did not exist 5 years ago. She revealed the digital registry tag linking the file's creation directly to the computer of Douglas's chief financial officer. She then requested permission to play a brief audio exhibit submitted into evidence. The judge granted it. Connor's hidden recording filled the quiet courtroom. Douglas's voice echoed off the mahogany walls, cold and demanding. Make the numbers fit the timeline. Use the signature file Connor dug up. The silence that followed the recording was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Douglas's litigator slowly sat down, physically distancing himself from his client. He knew he had just presented forged documents to a federal judge. Douglas, however, could not comprehend his defeat. His narcissistic reality fractured entirely. He stood up, ignoring his lawyer's frantic gestures to remain silent. His face was flushed with dark, uncontrolled rage. He slammed his fist onto the heavy wooden table, his voice echoing with absolute entitlement. I am her father. I built this family. I don't need permission to take back what belongs to my bloodline. It was the ultimate unforced confession of theft and forgery, recorded permanently into the court transcript. The judge did not yell. He simply struck his gavel, his eyes filled with absolute disgust. He dismissed the civil suit with extreme prejudice and immediately referred the forged documents to the district attorney for criminal fraud prosecution. The empire finally fell. The gavel had struck, and the federal referral for criminal fraud was officially on the record. But a cornered predator always has one last, desperate reflex. I knew Douglas too well to believe he would simply sit in that courtroom and wait for the authorities to draft an arrest warrant. By late Thursday evening, while the industry press was still processing the explosive revelation of the forged metadata, Patricia called me on my secure encrypted line. Her voice was sharp, vibrating with the thrill of the hunt. Douglas was attempting a false counterattack, a final, frantic financial maneuver designed to drain the last drops of blood from his sinking empire. He was not trying to win the lawsuit anymore. He was trying to fund his own escape. Patricia explained the mechanics of his desperation. Douglas's holding company still possessed a few $1 million in highly liquid, unrestricted capital, meant to cover the immediate payroll and supplier invoices for his hundreds of retail employees. He was attempting to utilize a 48-hour automated banking loophole. He had initiated a series of rapid, fragmented wire transfers, attempting to route those remaining millions through 3 different shell companies in offshore jurisdictions. He was intentionally bankrupting his own domestic operations, planning to leave his entire workforce completely destitute while he secured a golden parachute in a country without an extradition treaty. He thought the commercial judge's ruling only applied to my assets, leaving his own accounts temporarily unmonitored. He was entirely wrong. Patricia had anticipated this exact maneuver the moment she presented the audio recording in court. While Douglas was busy shouting his confession on the witness stand, Patricia's paralegal had been sitting in the back row, electronically filing an ex parte emergency injunction directly with the Federal Financial Regulatory Agency. We had already provided them with the explicit evidence of corporate fraud and the shell company account numbers Connor had surrendered. I sat in my apartment, watching the city lights blink against the dark window pane, listening to Patricia narrate the final trap at precisely 8 a.m. on Friday, just as Douglas's offshore wire transfers were queued for international clearance. The federal banking regulators slammed the door shut. A total asset freeze was executed across every single account linked to his social security number and corporate tax identification. The millions he tried to steal from his own employees were blocked mid-transaction. He could not move a single dollar. He could not buy a plane ticket. He could not even pay his silver-haired litigator. The false counterattack was crushed before it even breached the surface of the water, dismantled entirely by a preemptive stack of digital paperwork. He had tried to steal from his own sinking ship, only to find that we had already welded the lifeboats to the deck. The vault was locked. The absolute collapse of Douglas's retail empire was spectacularly public and ruthlessly swift. Within weeks, his primary creditors forced the conglomerate into receivership. The bank moved to auction off the remaining physical assets to recover fractions of their lost capital. I attended the commercial auction on a crisp, bright Tuesday morning. The sprawling, multi-level manufacturing warehouse in Brooklyn, the very building where my mother had once sketched her brilliant designs in obscurity, was up for sale. The air inside the cavernous space smelled of old machine oil, damp brick, and decades of stolen labour. A representative from the bank approached me, a desperate, hopeful gleam in his eye. He knew Silverbird was flush with capital, and he practically begged me to purchase the entire intellectual property portfolio of my father's brand alongside the real estate, offering it at a catastrophic discount. The industry fully expected me to seize the crown, to swallow my father's legacy, and rebrand it under my own name as the ultimate act of corporate vengeance. I looked at the dusty corporate logos painted on the factory walls. I felt absolutely no desire to wear his armour. I calmly informed the banker that I was purchasing the physical building, the heavy manufacturing machinery, and the basement archives containing my mother's original portfolios. I explicitly rejected the brand name, the trademark, and the corporate identity. I refused to build my future on a foundation of toxicity. As I walked out of the warehouse, Connor was waiting by my car. He looked anxious, shifting his weight from side to side. He had provided the audio recording that saved my company, and there was a silent, lingering expectation that he would be rewarded with a high-level executive position in my newly expanded enterprise. I looked at my younger brother, loving him deeply, but recognizing the absolute necessity of steel boundaries. I told him he was hired, but there would be no corner office and no vice president title. He was going to start on the production floor, managing inventory and logistics. He was going to submit to a full independent financial audit, and he was going to earn his promotions through documented merit, not through shared DNA or past favours. I was breaking the cycle of nepotism and manipulation that had poisoned our family for generations. Connor blinked, surprised by the coldness of the structure, but then he slowly nodded, understanding the respect hidden within the boundary. Nepotism was finally dead. 6 months later, the frantic, agonizing chaos of the courtroom felt like a lifetime away. I was standing backstage at New York Fashion Week, surrounded by the beautiful, orchestrated madness of a major runway production. The air vibrated with thumping bass, the sharp smell of premium hairspray, and the frantic whispers of my styling team. This was the highly anticipated, fully public debut of Silverbird. The world finally knew the identity of the ghost designer, and the industry was practically vibrating with expectation. I stood near the curtain, running my hands over the intricate beadwork of the collection, feeling a profound, quiet serenity anchoring my chest. The centerpiece of the show, the final garment that would close the runway, hung on a velvet mannequin in the center of the room. I had spent 4 sleepless weeks constructing it entirely by hand. I named the piece Inheritance Without Permission. It was not just a dress, it was a physical manifestation of my entire survival narrative. The bodice was constructed from a flawless, modern, sustainable silk, representing the pure, untainted future of my company. But the intricate, sweeping train told a different story. I had carefully woven in panels of the rough, faded wool coat I had worn on the freezing night Douglas threw me into the street. Winding seamlessly through that harsh wool was the delicate, intertwining silver vine pattern. I had recreated it directly from the original, yellowed sketches I had rescued from the hidden compartment of the rusty sewing machine. It was my mother's stolen genius, finally breathing under the bright, blinding lights of the runway, credited to her rightful legacy. Every stitch was a testament to resilience, a deliberate fusion of trauma and triumph. The models lined up, moving like a synchronized army of elegance. As the final model slipped into the Inheritance Without Permission gown, the backstage crew fell entirely silent. The dress moved like liquid history, a breathtaking visual argument that true power cannot be inherited through a bank account. It must be forged in the fire of absolute independence. The music swelled, a deep, triumphant crescendo, and she walked out into the blinding glare of the flashbulbs. I wore my history. The applause that rolled through the venue was not polite industry clapping. It was a deafening, visceral roar. I stood just behind the heavy black curtain, listening to the crowd react to the final piece. The stage manager touched my shoulder gently, signalling that it was time for the designer's final bow. For the past 5 years, I had hidden in the shadows, terrified of being seen, terrified of drawing the attention of the man who had tried to erase me. Now, the curtain was pulled back, and there was nowhere left to hide. I stepped out onto the polished white runway. The heat of the spotlights hit my face. I walked forward slowly, my posture straight, my chin held perfectly level. I looked out into the sea of industry titans, editors, and critics. Right in the centre of the front row sat Zeus. He looked incredibly sharp in a dark suit, his eyes locked onto mine with an expression of profound, quiet awe. Sitting on his lap, clapping her small hands with unbridled joy, was Edith. They looked like a perfect, idealised portrait of a wealthy family. The old version of me, the scared 19-year-old girl, might have rushed down the runway to grab his hand, desperate to visually prove to the world that I had been rescued by a powerful man. I did not reach for his hand. I walked to the end of the runway, completely alone, and offered a deep, respectful bow to the audience. I claimed my victory entirely for myself. I wanted the cameras to capture a woman who owned her empire outright, unshielded and unapologetic. When I finally turned and walked back, I caught Zeus's eye. He did not look offended, he smiled, a deep, genuine smile of absolute respect. He understood exactly what I was doing. He was not my saviour. He was my partner. After the show, in the quiet safety of my private dressing room, away from the flashing bulbs and the hungry press, I finally knelt down and wrapped my arms tightly around Edith, breathing in the scent of her hair. Zeus knelt beside us, wrapping his arms around both of us. The embrace was not a rescue mission. We were finally equals. Sunday mornings in our new Brooklyn townhouse possess a specific, golden quiet. The sunlight filters through the tall, arched windows, warming the wide oak floorboards. The frantic energy of the fashion district and the sterile, suffocating air of the federal courtroom do not exist in this space. I sat at the kitchen island, a hot mug of dark coffee resting in my hands. Zeus was standing by the stove, quietly turning the pages of the Sunday paper. From the living room, I could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of Edith humming to herself as she constructed a massive, intricate fortress out of wooden building blocks. I watched her stack the blocks with absolute precision, completely untouched by the generational trauma that had so deeply scarred my own childhood. She will never know what it feels like to have her worth tied to her obedience. She will never have to earn her right to exist in her own home. The irrevocable trust we established is secure, locking her financial future safely away from anyone's manipulation. But more importantly, the psychological boundaries are absolute. Douglas is serving a federal sentence for corporate fraud and perjury. He is a ghost, a cautionary tale, entirely excised from the narrative of our lives. Sometimes, people ask me if I regret tearing down my father's empire. They ask if the ruthless, methodical execution of the legal strategy was too cold, too unforgiving. They cling to the romanticised notion that blood demands endless grace. But grace without accountability is simply an invitation for further abuse. I look at my daughter, building her wooden castle in the sunlight, and I feel absolutely no remorse. True legacy is not about the money, the brand names, or the genetics you passively inherit. Legacy is about the toxic cycles you have the courage to break. It is about standing in the freezing snow, looking at the locked door of your past, and deciding to build your own sanctuary from scratch. If you think Dorothy was right to put her daughter's safety and her own business above forgiving and forgetting, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. The cycle was broken,